July 20th, 1944. A briefcase bomb explodes 3 feet from Hitler. In our timeline, he survives with minor injuries. But what if the bomb had been placed just 6 inches closer? What if German officers had successfully killed Hitler and seized control? The entire ending of World War II changes in an instant. This is the story of Operation Valkyrie, the closest anyone ever came to killing Adolf Hitler. And what would have happened if they had actually succeeded? Most people think killing Hitler would have instantly ended the war. They're wrong. What actually happens is far more complicated and creates a world we would barely recognize today. No Cold War as you know it, a completely different Europe, and a Soviet Union that might have conquered all of Germany. But before we can understand what would have changed, we need to know what actually happened on that day in 1944. And to understand that, we need to go back further and see how this plot even came together in the first place. The conspiracy to kill Hitler did not start in 1944. It had been building for years. As early as 1938, some German military officers were worried about Hitler's aggressive plans. They saw him leading Germany into a war that could not be won. But these early conspirators were small in number and had no real opportunity to act. When World War II started in 1939, Germany won victory after victory. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 1940. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. During this time, opposition to Hitler within the military almost disappeared. Why plot against a leader who was winning? But then things started to go wrong. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was supposed to be over in months. Instead, it turned into a grinding war of attrition. The German army got stuck outside Moscow in the brutal Russian winter. Soldiers froze to death. Equipment broke down. The easy victories were over. By 1942, some officers started quietly talking again about the need to remove Hitler. The United States had entered the war. Germany was now fighting the Soviets, the British, and the Americans all at once. Officers who understood strategy knew this was a war Germany could not win. The only question was how much destruction would happen before the inevitable defeat. The conspiracy grew slowly and carefully. Officers had to be extremely cautious. Hitler's security service, the SD, was everywhere. One wrong word to the wrong person meant arrest, torture, and execution. Families of conspirators would also be punished. The Nazis had a policy called Sippenhaft, which means clan liability. If you committed treason, your entire family could be arrested or killed. So the conspirators moved carefully. They recruited people they trusted completely. They used code words and secret meetings. They knew they would only get one chance. The key figure who emerged as the leader was Claus von Stauffenberg. He came from an aristocratic family with a long military tradition. He joined the army in 1926 and was a talented officer who rose through the ranks. He served in Poland, France, and then in North Africa. In April 1943, Stauffenberg's unit was attacked by Allied aircraft in Tunisia. He was severely wounded. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. He spent months recovering in a hospital in Munich. During this recovery, Stauffenberg made his decision. He would kill Hitler. Germany was losing the war. The Nazi regime was committing horrible crimes. The only way to save Germany from total destruction was to remove Hitler and negotiate peace with the Allies. But Stauffenberg had a problem. He was badly injured. How could he plant a bomb when he only had 3 fingers on one hand? He practiced for months, learning how to arm a bomb with his limited dexterity. He became surprisingly good at it. By late 1943, Stauffenberg was back on active duty. His injuries actually helped him in an unexpected way. He was assigned to work in the Reserve Army headquarters in Berlin. This was a desk job, which normally would have been a step down for an ambitious officer. But it gave him something valuable: access to Hitler. As a staff officer in the Reserve Army, Stauffenberg was occasionally required to attend briefings with Hitler to report on troop numbers and readiness. This gave him the opportunity he needed. The conspirators refined their plan throughout early 1944. They were not just planning to kill Hitler. They were planning a complete military coup to take over the entire German government. The plan had several stages. First, kill Hitler. Second, use the existing emergency plan called Operation Valkyrie to mobilize the Reserve Army. Third, arrest all Nazi Party officials and SS leadership. Fourth, immediately contact the Western Allies to negotiate peace. The beauty of using Operation Valkyrie was that it was a legitimate plan that already existed. Hitler himself had approved it. It was designed to maintain order in Germany if there was an internal uprising or if the Nazi leadership was somehow incapacitated. The conspirators planned to activate this real plan by claiming that the SS had attempted a coup and that the army needed to restore order. Stauffenberg tried to kill Hitler multiple times before July 20th. In July 1944 alone, he made 3 attempts. On July 6th, he brought a bomb to a meeting at Hitler's residence in Bavaria, but Hitler left early and Stauffenberg could not get close enough. On July 11th, he went to another briefing, but Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring were not present. The conspirators wanted to kill all 3 at once, so Stauffenberg did not activate the bomb. On July 15th, he went to the Wolf's Lair with a bomb, but again, the conditions were not right. Each failed attempt increased the risk of discovery. Each time Stauffenberg traveled with a bomb, he risked being randomly searched. Each delay gave the Gestapo more time to possibly uncover the plot. The conspirators knew they were running out of time. Finally, on July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg decided he would act no matter what. Even if Göring and Himmler were not present, he would kill Hitler. That would be enough to create the chaos needed for the coup. Let me walk you through that day in detail, because understanding exactly what happened helps us see how close the plot came to succeeding. Stauffenberg woke up early at his home in Berlin. He had breakfast with his brother Berthold, who was also part of the conspiracy. They did not talk much. Both men knew this might be the last time they saw each other. Stauffenberg and his aide, Werner von Haeften, drove to an airfield and took a military plane to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, about 300 miles away. They arrived around 10 a.m. The Wolf's Lair was Hitler's military headquarters on the Eastern Front. It was a massive complex hidden in a forest with bunkers, barracks, and security checkpoints. Getting into the Wolf's Lair required multiple security checks, but Stauffenberg had the right credentials. He was expected at a military briefing at 12:30 p.m. Stauffenberg carried 2 bombs in his briefcase. Each bomb was a British-made plastic explosive with a chemical timer. You crushed a small glass vial, which released acid. The acid ate through a wire. When the wire broke, it released a firing pin that detonated the explosive. The timer was set for 10 minutes. The original plan was to use both bombs together for maximum explosive power. But when Stauffenberg arrived, things got complicated. The briefing was moved from Hitler's underground bunker to a conference room in a wooden building above ground. This was bad news for the conspirators. An underground bunker would contain the blast and make it more deadly. An above-ground wooden building would allow the blast to dissipate. But there was nothing Stauffenberg could do about this change. Just before the briefing, Stauffenberg asked to use a bathroom to freshen up. This was his chance to arm the bombs. He and Haeften went to a private room. Stauffenberg opened his briefcase and prepared to activate both bombs. But then an officer knocked on the door and told Stauffenberg to hurry up because the briefing was about to start. Stauffenberg only had time to activate 1 bomb. He crushed the vial, starting the 10-minute timer. He closed the briefcase. He and Haeften left the room. Haeften took the second bomb and hid it in his coat. They would dispose of it later. Stauffenberg entered the conference room. About 24 people were present, gathered around a large, heavy oak table. Hitler was standing at the middle of the table, leaning over maps showing the Eastern Front. Officers were giving reports about troop movements and Soviet attacks. Stauffenberg moved close to Hitler and placed his briefcase under the table, as near to Hitler as possible. The briefcase was about 3 feet from Hitler's legs. Then Stauffenberg excused himself, saying he needed to make an urgent phone call to Berlin. No one thought this was suspicious. Officers frequently came and went during these long briefings. Stauffenberg left the room. The bomb was now counting down. He had about 8 minutes left. He walked quickly but calmly toward the parking area where his car was waiting. Inside the conference room, an officer named Heinz Brandt found Stauffenberg's briefcase in his way as he tried to get closer to the map table. He picked it up and moved it to the other side of a thick oak table leg, further away from Hitler. This simple action would change history. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The blast was enormous. It shattered all the windows. The roof partially collapsed. The room filled with smoke and debris. People were thrown to the ground. 4 men died. Brandt, who had moved the briefcase, was killed. A stenographer was killed. 2 other officers died from their injuries. Hitler survived. The heavy oak table leg shielded him from the worst of the blast. The fact that the explosion happened in a wooden building above ground, rather than a concrete bunker, also saved him. Much of the explosive force went out through the windows and the thin walls rather than being contained in a confined space. Hitler's hair was singed. His right arm was temporarily paralyzed. His eardrums were damaged. His legs were burned. But he could walk. Within minutes, he was outside, being examined by his doctor. Stauffenberg saw the explosion from about 200 yards away. He saw the building explode and assumed no one could have survived. He and Haften got into their car. They had to bluff their way through multiple security checkpoints. At the first checkpoint, the guards had already heard about the explosion and were not letting anyone leave. But Stauffenberg was a senior officer. He claimed he had urgent orders to return to Berlin immediately. The guards let him through. At the second checkpoint, the same thing happened. Stauffenberg used his rank and his confidence to get past the confused guards. On the way to the airfield, he and Haften threw the second and used bomb out of the car window into the forest. They reached the airfield and boarded their plane. As they flew back to Berlin, Stauffenberg was confident the mission had succeeded. He had seen the explosion. He could not imagine Hitler surviving that blast. But back at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler was very much alive. He was angry and shocked, but he was thinking clearly. Within an hour, he was making phone calls. He spoke to Mussolini, who was visiting that day. He spoke to Göring. He spoke to Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. The Nazi leadership immediately began investigating who was responsible. It did not take them long to figure out that Stauffenberg had been in the room and had left just before the explosion. Orders went out to arrest Stauffenberg as soon as he landed in Berlin. But the orders got confused. Communications were chaotic. Some orders said to arrest Stauffenberg. Other orders said to secure government buildings because of an SS coup. The conspirators in Berlin had already started activating Operation Valkyrie, spreading the false story that the SS had tried to kill Hitler and that the army needed to take control. Stauffenberg landed in Berlin around 4 p.m., more than 3 hours after the explosion. He went immediately to the Reserve Army headquarters on Bendlerstrasse, where the other main conspirators were waiting. This is where things fell apart for the conspirators. For several crucial hours after the explosion, they had failed to act decisively. They knew an explosion had happened at the Wolf's Lair, but they did not know if Hitler was dead. Some conspirators argued they should wait for confirmation. Others said they needed to act immediately. They argued back and forth while precious time slipped away. When Stauffenberg arrived, he insisted Hitler was dead. He had seen the explosion. No one could survive. The conspirators finally began sending out orders to military units all over Germany and occupied Europe. The orders said the SS had attempted a coup, that Hitler might be dead, and that the army was taking control under Operation Valkyrie. Some units followed these orders. In Paris, the military governor, who was part of the plot, arrested over 1,200 SS and Gestapo officers. In Vienna, army units surrounded SS headquarters. In Berlin, a reserve battalion actually surrounded the government district and blocked roads. But many commanders hesitated. They received conflicting orders. They were not sure who was really in charge. And then, around 6:30 p.m., radio broadcasts began announcing that Hitler had survived the assassination attempt and would address the nation soon. This destroyed the conspiracy. Once everyone knew Hitler was alive, the coup lost all legitimacy. Units that had been following Valkyrie orders stopped and waited for clarification. In some cases, officers who had been arrested were released. In Berlin, the reserve battalion that had surrounded the government district was ordered to stand down. At the Bendlerstrasse headquarters, the conspirators realized they had failed. Some tried to escape. Some argued about what to do next. Around 11 p.m., officers who were not part of the conspiracy and who remained loyal to Hitler broke into the building and arrested the main conspirators. Stauffenberg, along with 3 other leaders of the plot, was taken to a courtyard and executed by firing squad shortly after midnight. They were shot by flashlight in the courtyard of the building where they had planned to overthrow the Nazi regime. Other conspirators were arrested over the following days and weeks. Hitler was determined to destroy everyone connected to the plot. The Gestapo arrested over 7,000 people. About 5,000 of them were executed. Many were hanged slowly with piano wire, and some executions were filmed so Hitler could watch them. Among those executed were Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, General Friedrich Albrecht, and many other high-ranking officers. Even Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, was implicated in the plot. Rather than face a public trial, he was forced to commit suicide by taking poison. The Nazis told the public he had died of his wounds from an earlier Allied attack. That is what really happened. Now let's explore what would have happened if that briefcase had not been moved. What if Hitler died in that explosion on July 20th, 1944? First, let's be absolutely clear about the timeline and the situation in the summer of 1944. This is crucial for understanding what happens next. D-Day happened on June 6, 1944, 6 weeks before the assassination attempt. Allied forces landed in Normandy and established a beachhead. By July 20th, they had broken out of the initial landing zones and were pushing into France. But they had not yet liberated Paris. They were not yet at the German border. The Battle of Normandy was still ongoing. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets had launched Operation Bagration on June 23rd, just weeks before the bomb. This was one of the largest Soviet offensives of the entire war. It was destroying the German Army Group Center. By July 20th, Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of miles and were approaching the borders of Poland and East Prussia. Germany still controlled most of Western Europe, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and parts of Italy. But the military situation was clearly hopeless. The Western Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Germany was running out of men, fuel, and equipment. Every professional military officer knew Germany would lose. The only question was when and how badly. In the Pacific, Japan was also losing to the Americans. Germany's ally was doomed. There would be no help coming from that direction. So the bomb explodes, and this time Hitler is killed instantly. Everyone in that conference room dies or is critically wounded. The blast is devastating. News begins to spread, but it spreads slowly and confusingly because communications in 1944 are nothing like today. There is no internet, no cell phones, no instant messaging. Stauffenberg leaves the Wolf's Lair, drives to the airfield, and flies back to Berlin, just like in our real timeline. But this time, when he lands, there is no radio announcement that Hitler survived. There is only confusion and chaos. The conspirators at the Bendlerstrasse begin activating Operation Valkyrie. They send out orders that the SS has attempted a coup against the Führer and that the Wehrmacht must secure all government and communication facilities. They order the arrest of all SS leadership and Nazi Party officials. Now here is where things get complicated. The conspirators are not a unified group with a clear chain of command. They are a loose network of officers who all have different ideas about what should happen next. Some want to immediately contact the Western Allies and surrender. Others want to continue fighting the Soviets while negotiating with the West. Some believe they can somehow keep Germany's conquests in the East while giving up territory in the West. They have not fully agreed on what happens after Hitler is dead. Meanwhile, the two most powerful Nazis after Hitler are still alive. Hermann Göring is the head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor. Heinrich Himmler is the head of the SS, which controls hundreds of thousands of armed men who are fanatically loyal to the Nazi cause. When news reaches Göring that there has been an explosion at the Wolf's Lair and that Hitler might be dead, he does not immediately believe the army's claim that the SS is responsible. Göring is many things, but he is not stupid. He suspects this might be an army coup. He begins making his own calls to Luftwaffe units, trying to figure out what is really happening. Himmler reacts even more quickly. The SS has its own intelligence network. Within hours, Himmler knows that Wehrmacht units are arresting SS officers in Berlin, Paris, and Vienna. He knows this is not an SS coup against Hitler. This is an army coup against the entire Nazi leadership. Himmler orders all SS units to resist arrest and to secure their positions. Within 24 hours of Hitler's death, Germany is on the brink of civil war. In some cities, army units and SS units are facing each other with weapons drawn. In Berlin, fighting breaks out in several locations. It is not a full-scale battle, but there are shootings and small skirmishes. The German people are confused and frightened. Radio broadcasts are contradictory. Some stations, controlled by the conspirators, announce that Hitler is dead and that the army has taken control to save Germany. Other stations, controlled by Nazi loyalists, claim that traitors in the army have murdered the Führer and that all true Germans must resist. Now let's talk about the personalities involved, because this matters for what happens next. Stauffenberg and the main conspirators are idealists in a strange way. They are not Democrats. They are not liberals. Most of them are conservative, nationalist officers who believe in a strong Germany. But they are not Nazis. They oppose Hitler because they believe he is destroying Germany, not because they believe in democracy or human rights. Their plan for post-Hitler Germany is vague. They talk about restoring order and honor. They want to negotiate with the Western Allies, but continue fighting the Soviets. They believe Britain and America will accept this because the Western Allies must fear Soviet expansion into Europe. But there is a huge problem with this plan. The Western Allies have already announced a policy of unconditional surrender. This was decided at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, where Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Germany must surrender completely to all Allied powers at once. No separate peace, no negotiations, complete surrender. Why did the Allies make this decision? Because in World War I, Germany surrendered without being invaded. This allowed German nationalists to later claim that Germany had not really lost the war, that they had been stabbed in the back by politicians and Jews. This myth helped Hitler rise to power. Roosevelt and Churchill were determined not to repeat that mistake. This time, Germany would be completely defeated with no room for myths or excuses. So when the German conspirators send out peace feelers to Britain and America, offering to surrender in the West while continuing to fight in the East, the initial response from London and Washington is firmly negative. No separate peace. Germany must surrender unconditionally to all allies simultaneously. But now there is a complication. Hitler is dead. The Nazi leadership is in disarray. The German army is offering to cooperate. If the Western Allies refuse to negotiate, the only alternative is to keep fighting until Germany completely collapses. That could take many more months and cost tens of thousands more Allied lives. Churchill sees an opportunity. He is already worried about Soviet expansion into Europe. He has been arguing with Roosevelt about post-war plans. Churchill believes the West needs a strong Germany as a buffer against the Soviets. If the German army is willing to cooperate, why not use them? Roosevelt is more idealistic and more committed to the alliance with Stalin. He does not want to do anything that looks like the West making a separate deal with Germany. He knows Stalin would see this as a betrayal. And Roosevelt needs Stalin's help to fight Japan after Germany is defeated. So a debate begins within the Allied leadership. Churchill argues for accepting the German offer, at least informally. Roosevelt argues for sticking to unconditional surrender. The debate takes days while the situation in Germany becomes more chaotic. During this crucial period, Germany is essentially ungoverned. The Wehrmacht controls some areas. The SS controls others. In some regions, local Nazi Party officials maintain control. In other regions, ordinary Germans just try to stay out of the way and wait to see who wins. The fighting in the West continues. Allied forces are advancing through France. But now something strange happens. Some German units are surrendering without much fight. Other units, mostly SS divisions, are fighting fanatically. The Western Allied commanders are confused by the inconsistent resistance. On the Eastern Front, the situation is clearer. Almost all German units continue fighting desperately against the Soviets. The officers know that surrendering to the Red Army means either death or decades in Soviet labor camps. They fight on regardless of the political chaos in Berlin. Stalin watches all of this very carefully. He sees the confusion in Germany. He sees the German officers trying to negotiate with the West. He suspects, correctly, that the Germans are trying to split the alliance. His response is to push even harder. Soviet forces accelerate their offensive. Stalin orders his generals to advance as quickly as possible and occupy as much German territory as they can before any kind of armistice can be arranged. He wants facts on the ground. Whatever happens politically, he wants the Red Army to be deep inside Germany. By August 1944, about 2 weeks after Hitler's death, the situation has stabilized somewhat. The internal power struggle in Germany has been won by the army officers. Himmler has been captured and executed by the conspirators. Göring, seeing which way the wind is blowing, has fled to Austria where some SS units still control territory. Most of the Nazi Party leadership has been arrested or killed. A provisional military government forms in Berlin, led by a council of senior Wehrmacht officers. They are not elected. They simply declare themselves the legitimate government of Germany. They immediately send formal peace proposals to Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. To the Western Allies, they offer immediate cessation of hostilities in the West, withdrawal from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and cooperation in fighting the Soviet advance. To the Soviets, they offer nothing. They know Stalin will accept nothing less than complete occupation and destruction of Germany. Churchill wants to accept the Western offer. He sees the strategic value, but Roosevelt refuses. After much argument, they compromise on a middle path. They will not formally accept the German offer, but they will slow their advance and see what happens. They tell the Germans that any peace must include surrender to the Soviets as well, but they do not enforce this demand militarily. This creates a bizarre situation. The war in the West enters a kind of semi-frozen state. German forces withdraw from France without much fighting. Paris is liberated in early August, weeks earlier than in our timeline. Allied forces advance quickly, but without the heavy casualties they suffered in our real timeline. By September, the Western Allies have reached the German border. And then they stop. Without officially declaring a ceasefire, both sides stop fighting in the West. British and American forces sit on the western border of Germany. German forces man defensive positions, but neither side is actively attacking. In the east, there is no pause. Soviet forces smash through German defensive lines. The Wehrmacht is trying to fight, but the internal chaos in Germany has disrupted supply lines and command structures. Units run out of ammunition. Reinforcements get sent to the wrong locations. The Red Army advances faster than in our real timeline. By October 1944, Soviet forces have occupied all of Poland and are pushing into East Prussia and Eastern Germany. The Wehrmacht is in full retreat. The provisional military government in Berlin sends increasingly desperate messages to London and Washington. Help us stop the Soviets, or they will conquer all of Europe. Churchill tells Roosevelt, "I told you so." The Soviets are proving to be just as imperialistic as he warned. Roosevelt is frustrated but still committed to the alliance with Stalin. He refuses to turn against the Soviets. In November 1944, a crisis point is reached. Soviet forces are approaching Berlin from the east. The Western Allies are sitting on the western border of Germany, watching. The German military government makes a final offer. Let us surrender to you, occupy Western Germany, and help us hold the line against Stalin. Otherwise, the Soviets will take everything. This time, Churchill manages to convince Roosevelt. The strategic situation is too important to ignore. If the Soviets occupy all of Germany, they will dominate all of Europe. American and British forces begin crossing into Western Germany, not as conquerors, but as occupiers of territory being handed to them by the German military. When Stalin learns that Western Allied forces are occupying Western Germany while the Germans continue fighting in the East, he is furious. He sees this as exactly the betrayal he feared. He accuses Britain and America of making a separate peace with fascists. He threatens to stop fighting Japan. He threatens to make his own separate peace with the German military government. Roosevelt and Churchill try to calm him down. They insist they have not made peace with Germany. They are simply occupying German territory to prevent chaos. They promise that German military leaders will still be tried for war crimes. They invite Stalin to a conference to negotiate the final settlement. But Stalin is not mollified. He orders the Red Army to push even harder. By December 1944, Soviet forces occupy Berlin. The German military government flees west. Some officers surrender to the Western Allies. Others are captured by the Soviets. By January 1945, the war in Europe is effectively over, but there has been no formal surrender. Instead, there is a messy, confused situation where Germany has been divided by military occupation. The Western Allies control everything west of the Elbe River. The Soviets control everything east of the Elbe, including Berlin. Neither side trusts the other. Both sides are heavily armed and facing each other across a river. Incidents occur. Soviet and American patrols sometimes exchange fire. The situation is extremely tense. In February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meet at Yalta, just like in our real timeline. But the meeting is much more confrontational. Stalin accuses the West of betraying the alliance. Churchill accuses Stalin of trying to conquer all of Europe. Roosevelt tries to mediate, but is clearly siding more with Churchill now. The result is a cold peace agreement. Germany is formally divided along the current occupation lines. The Elbe River becomes the border between Soviet and Western zones. Berlin, being on the Soviet side, remains entirely under Soviet control. There is no divided Berlin like in our real timeline. All sides agree to try German military and political leaders for war crimes. The Nuremberg trials happen, but they look different. Instead of Nazi party leaders like Göring and Ribbentrop, the defendants are Wehrmacht generals and officers. They try to defend themselves by saying they removed Hitler and tried to stop the war. Some are acquitted. Others are convicted and executed. The trials are controversial, and many people question whether justice was served. The Holocaust is still discovered. The concentration camps are still liberated. The world is still horrified. But the narrative is complicated by the fact that the people who ran the camps were mostly killed in the internal chaos after Hitler's death, or were executed by the military conspirators, or fled and were never caught. There are fewer clear villains to put on trial. In the Pacific, the war against Japan continues. The atomic bombs are still dropped in August 1945. Japan surrenders. World War II is finally completely over. But the peace is uneasy. The alliance between the West and the Soviet Union has been badly damaged. Stalin believes the West betrayed him by occupying Germany while leaving the Soviets to do the hardest fighting. Churchill and Roosevelt believe Stalin would have conquered all of Europe if they had not acted. The Cold War begins immediately, without the brief period of cooperation that occurred in our real timeline after 1945. The division of Europe is more stark. The Iron Curtain falls along the Elbe River in Germany and extends north and south from there. Eastern Germany under Soviet occupation suffers terribly. Stalin treats it as conquered enemy territory. Factories are dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union. The population is subjected to harsh control. The East German economy collapses. Western Germany recovers much more quickly. The Marshall Plan pours money into rebuilding. But there is also more tolerance for former Wehrmacht officers because they are seen as the men who removed Hitler. Many former officers end up in positions of power in the new West German government. This creates ongoing controversy and accusations that the West has gone soft on Nazi collaborators. The broader Cold War that follows is more dangerous than in our timeline. The two superpowers do not trust each other at all. There is no period of alliance to look back on. From 1945 onward, it is pure confrontation. NATO forms in 1949, earlier than in our timeline. The Warsaw Pact forms in response. Both sides build up huge military forces directly facing each other across the Elbe. The risk of accidental war is very high. The nuclear arms race proceeds faster. Both sides feel more threatened. By the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union have large nuclear arsenals pointed at each other. The Cuban Missile Crisis, or something like it, happens but possibly earlier and possibly with a different outcome. One major difference is Berlin. In our timeline, West Berlin was an isolated pocket of Western democracy deep inside East Germany. It became a symbol of resistance to communism. The Berlin airlift in 1948 was a defining moment of the early Cold War. In this alternate timeline, there is no West Berlin. The entire city is in the Soviet zone. There is no airlift. There is no dramatic symbol of Western resolve. Instead, the confrontation point is the Elbe River, where two massive armies face each other directly. This makes the Cold War more militarized and less about ideological competition. It is less about which system is better and more about raw power and territorial control. Over the decades, the Cold War continues with multiple crises. The Korean War probably still happens. The Vietnam War might happen differently or not at all. The space race still happens, with both sides competing for technological supremacy. The 1960s see several close calls for nuclear war. The constant military confrontation along the Elbe creates incidents that could spiral out of control. But each time, both sides step back from the brink, knowing that nuclear war would destroy both countries. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union is in economic decline, just like in our timeline. The centrally planned economy cannot compete with Western capitalism. The Soviet leadership knows they need reform. Mikhail Gorbachev, or someone like him, comes to power and begins reforms. Glasnost and perestroika happen. The Soviet Empire begins to crumble. Eastern European countries demand freedom. German reunification becomes a possibility. But it is more complicated than in our timeline. In our world, Germany was reunified in 1990 through negotiation. In this alternate world, there is more resentment on both sides. East Germans blame their suffering on the betrayal of 1944. West Germans blame the Soviets for occupying more than they should have. Reunification happens, but it takes longer and is more painful. It might not happen until the mid-1990s. When it does happen, the unified Germany is more troubled, with deeper divisions between East and West. The long-term legacy of this alternate timeline is a world that is more divided and more militarized. The Cold War was more dangerous and lasted longer. The memory of World War II is more complicated and controversial. And the question of what the German officers who killed Hitler really were, heroes or war criminals trying to save themselves, is never fully resolved. Different historians argue different interpretations. Some say the officers were brave men who tried to stop a madman. Others say they were complicit in Hitler's crimes and only turned against him when they saw Germany was losing. This debate continues for generations. In popular culture, movies and books about Operation Valkyrie have a different tone. Instead of tragic heroes who failed, they are controversial figures who succeeded but whose success led to unexpected consequences. The story becomes less about individual courage and more about unintended results and moral ambiguity. And that brings us to the fundamental question: would the world have been better if Operation Valkyrie had succeeded? The answer is complicated. In the short term, yes. The war in Europe would have ended several months earlier. Maybe 100,000 fewer people would have died in combat. Maybe some concentration camp prisoners would have been liberated sooner. But in the long term, maybe not. The Cold War would have been more dangerous. The division of Germany would have been more bitter. The memory of World War II would be more controversial. The clear moral lesson of that war, that fascism must be completely defeated, would be muddied by the fact that German officers overthrew Hitler and then negotiated with the West. There is also a darker possibility. What if the plot succeeded, but not the way the conspirators planned? What if Hitler was killed, but Himmler took power? Himmler was a true believer in Nazi ideology. He might have continued the war fanatically. He might have accelerated the Holocaust, trying to complete it before Germany fell. In this scenario, millions more Jews and other victims might have died. Or what if the assassination led to complete chaos in Germany, with different factions fighting each other? This could have prolonged the war and made the final collapse even more bloody and destructive. History is full of these what-if scenarios, and they remind us that there are no simple answers. Killing Hitler in 1944 sounds like an obviously good thing, but the consequences could have been better or worse than what actually happened. The officers who planned Operation Valkyrie were not saints. They were professional soldiers who had helped Hitler conquer Europe. Many of them knew about the Holocaust and did nothing. They only turned against Hitler when they saw Germany was losing. Their motivation was not morality, but pragmatism. They wanted to save Germany and save themselves. But they also showed courage. They risked their lives and the lives of their families. They tried to stop a war that was destroying their country. They tried to prevent more deaths. In the end, they failed, and they paid with their lives. The real Operation Valkyrie failed by 6 inches. A briefcase moved 6 inches to the other side of a table leg. That tiny detail changed everything. If the plot had succeeded, we would be living in a very different world today. Germany would look different. Europe would look different. The Cold War would have been different. Our entire understanding of World War II and its lessons would be different. But there is one more aspect we need to consider. What would have happened to the Holocaust survivors and the Jewish people in this alternate timeline? In our real history, the liberation of the concentration camps by Allied forces was a clear-cut moment. The Allies were heroes who freed the prisoners. The Nazis were villains who had committed unspeakable crimes. The moral clarity was absolute. This clarity helped build support for the creation of Israel and for ensuring that the Holocaust would never be forgotten. In the alternate timeline where German officers killed Hitler and then negotiated with the West, this clarity gets muddied. The officers who overthrew Hitler would claim they were planning to stop the Holocaust. They would say they were the good Germans who tried to save everyone. Some people would believe them. Others would point out that these same officers had allowed the Holocaust to happen for years and only acted when Germany was losing. This debate would affect how the world responded to Holocaust survivors. In our timeline, there was universal sympathy and a strong push to ensure Jewish survivors had a homeland. The creation of Israel in 1948 had broad support, partly because the full horror of the Holocaust was undeniable and the guilt was clear. In the alternate timeline, some people might argue that not all Germans were guilty, that some tried to stop Hitler, and that therefore the response does not need to be as dramatic. This could weaken support for Israel or delay its creation. On the other hand, the Holocaust still happened. The camps were still discovered. The evidence was still overwhelming. The survivors still needed help. So Israel probably still forms in 1948, but the political dynamics might be different. The relationship between Israel, Germany, and the Western powers might be more complicated. Another question is what happens to Nazi technology and scientists in this alternate timeline. In our real history, the United States and the Soviet Union both grabbed German scientists and technology at the end of the war. The Americans got Wernher von Braun and the rocket team that later helped create NASA. The Soviets got their own German scientists and technology. This created a moral dilemma. These scientists had worked for the Nazis. Some had used slave labor, but they had valuable knowledge. Both superpowers decided that the strategic value outweighed the moral problems. They quietly brought these scientists to their countries and gave them new lives. In the alternate timeline, this process might be even more extensive. If the German military cooperated with the West at the end of the war, the Americans might get access to more German technology and more scientists. The space race might be even more dominated by the Americans because they got a bigger head start. But this would also mean more former Nazi collaborators living comfortably in America and the Soviet Union. The moral compromise would be even larger. This would fuel controversy for decades. Let's also think about how individual countries would be different in this alternate timeline. France would be liberated earlier, in August 1944 instead of late August. This means less destruction in Paris and other French cities. Fewer French civilians would die. The French resistance would have less time to prove itself in combat. Charles de Gaulle would still emerge as the leader of Free France, but his position might be weaker because the liberation happened more through German collapse than through French and Allied fighting. The Netherlands would also be liberated earlier. In our timeline, the Netherlands suffered through the Hunger Winter of 1944 to 1945, when tens of thousands of Dutch civilians starved because the Germans had cut off food supplies. In the alternate timeline, the liberation happens before winter, and this tragedy is avoided. Tens of thousands of Dutch lives are saved. Poland would suffer even more in the alternate timeline. The Warsaw Uprising happened in August 1944 when the Polish resistance tried to liberate Warsaw before the Soviets arrived. In our timeline, the Soviets waited outside Warsaw and let the Germans crush the uprising, killing over 200,000 Poles. In the alternate timeline, with Germany in chaos and Soviet forces advancing faster, the uprising might succeed initially, but then the Soviets would occupy Warsaw even more firmly. The Polish people would end up under Soviet control either way, but possibly with even more destruction and death. Italy would see less change. The Italian campaign was already its own front, separate from the main action. Italy had already switched sides in 1943. The fighting in Italy would probably continue much the same way, with Allied forces slowly pushing north against German resistance. The main difference would be that some German units in Italy might surrender earlier once news of Hitler's death reaches them. Japan would see almost no change in the short term. The Pacific War had its own momentum. The killing of Hitler in July 1944 would not affect American strategy against Japan. The island-hopping campaign would continue. The firebombing of Japanese cities would continue. The atomic bombs would still be dropped in August 1945. The only difference might be that the Soviet Union would have more forces available to attack Japan in August 1945. In our timeline, Stalin waited until after Germany surrendered before attacking Japan. In the alternate timeline, with Germany effectively out of the war by late 1944, Stalin could attack Japan earlier if he wanted to. But he probably would not, because he was too focused on securing control of Eastern Europe. Now let's think about how the post-war trials would be different in detail. The Nuremberg trials in our timeline put 24 major Nazi leaders on trial. The most prominent defendants were Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, and Alfred Jodl. The trials established important principles about war crimes and crimes against humanity. The message was clear: following orders is not an excuse for committing atrocities. In the alternate timeline, most of the top Nazi leaders are already dead. Hitler was killed in the explosion. Himmler was executed by the military conspirators. Goebbels probably committed suicide when he realized the coup was succeeding. Göring fled and might have been killed trying to escape, or might have been captured later. So who gets put on trial? The answer is complicated and controversial. The defendants would be a mix of lower-level Nazi Party officials who were captured, SS officers who commanded concentration camps, Wehrmacht generals who are accused of war crimes on the Eastern Front, some of the military conspirators who killed Hitler but who also committed crimes earlier in the war. This creates a huge problem. How do you try someone who helped commit atrocities but then helped end the war? Do they get credit for turning against Hitler? Or are they still guilty of their earlier crimes? Different people would have different answers. The Soviets would want to execute everyone connected to the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Western Allies would want to be more lenient toward officers who cooperated. Holocaust survivors would want justice for the people who ran the camps, regardless of what they did later. The trials would be much more controversial and would probably result in more acquittals. This would anger many people who feel that justice was not served. But others would argue that the people who removed Hitler deserve some leniency. One particular case that would be fascinating is Claus von Stauffenberg himself. In our timeline, he was executed hours after the plot failed. In the alternate timeline, he survives and becomes a key figure in the transition government. He would testify at Nuremberg, explaining the conspiracy and defending his actions. Stauffenberg would be controversial. Some would see him as a hero who saved Germany. Others would point out that he served Hitler loyally for years, fought in Poland and France and North Africa, and only turned against the regime when Germany was losing. He would probably not be put on trial himself because the Western Allies would see him as useful, but he would live the rest of his life as a divisive figure, praised by some and condemned by others. Let's also consider the cultural and psychological impact of this alternate history on the German people themselves. In our real timeline, Germany went through a process called denazification after the war. The Allied occupiers tried to remove Nazi ideology from German society. They arrested Nazi party members, banned Nazi symbols, and re-educated the German population. This process was imperfect and incomplete, but it happened. Germans had to confront the fact that they had followed Hitler into a catastrophic war and committed terrible crimes. This confrontation was painful but necessary. It led to the development of a strong anti-fascist culture in post-war Germany, especially in West Germany. Germans learned to be suspicious of nationalism and militarism. They built a democratic culture based on remembering the crimes of the Nazi era and ensuring they never happened again. In the alternate timeline, this process would be more complicated. Some Germans would claim that the army removed Hitler and tried to stop the war. They would argue that not all Germans were Nazis, that there was internal resistance, and that Germany should get some credit for this. This narrative would make it easier for Germans to avoid fully confronting their guilt. This could lead to a less thorough denazification. Former Wehrmacht officers would remain respected figures. Nationalism might remain stronger. The culture of remembrance and anti-fascism might be weaker. On the other hand, the Holocaust still happened and would still be impossible to deny. The evidence would still be overwhelming. So Germany would still have to confront this crime. But the conversation would be different. Instead of "we followed an evil leader," it might be "we followed an evil leader, but some of us tried to stop him." This subtle difference in narrative could have big effects on German political culture for generations. Now let's think about one more alternate scenario within this alternate timeline. What if the assassination succeeded but the coup failed? This is actually a very plausible scenario. Hitler is killed by the bomb, but the military coup does not succeed in taking control of the government. Maybe Göring and Himmler react faster. Maybe more military units stay loyal to the Nazi Party. Maybe the conspirators make mistakes in executing their plan. In this version, Hitler dies, but the Nazi regime survives. Göring becomes the new Führer. Or maybe Himmler seizes power. Or maybe they share power in some kind of collective leadership. What happens then? The new leadership would probably hunt down everyone connected to the assassination. Stauffenberg and thousands of others would be executed. The regime would become even more paranoid and brutal. But the war situation would not change. Germany would still be losing on both fronts. The new leadership would face the same impossible strategic situation that Hitler faced. They would have to decide whether to fight to the bitter end or seek some kind of negotiated peace. Göring was more pragmatic than Hitler. He might be willing to negotiate, but he would have no credibility with the Allies. Britain and America had already decided they would not negotiate with Nazi leadership. So even with Hitler dead, unconditional surrender would still be the only option. The war would probably continue until Germany completely collapsed, just like in our real timeline. But it might take even longer because the regime would be even more brutal in its efforts to maintain control. More German civilians would be executed for defeatism. More resources would be wasted on futile last stands. The final collapse might not come until mid-1945 or even later. This would actually be the worst possible outcome. Hitler is killed, giving false hope that the war might end sooner, but then the Nazi regime survives and prolongs the suffering. Fortunately, in most realistic scenarios where Hitler is killed, the regime does not survive. Too much of the Nazi system depended on Hitler personally. He was the ultimate authority who kept the different power centers in balance. With him gone, the system would tear itself apart through internal power struggles. So let's return to the most likely alternate timeline. Hitler is killed, the military conspirators take control, they negotiate with the Western Allies. Germany is divided along the Elbe River, and a more dangerous Cold War begins. One final question worth exploring. How would this alternate history affect our world today, in 2025? Germany would probably be reunified by now. The Soviet Union collapsed in our timeline around 1990 to 1991, and it would probably collapse around the same time in the alternate timeline. The economic problems that doomed the Soviet Union were structural and would happen regardless of the details of how World War II ended. So by the early 1990s, East and West Germany would reunify. But the reunification would be harder than in our timeline. The division would have been more bitter. East Germany under Soviet occupation would have suffered more. The cultural gap between East and West would be wider. Modern Germany might be more nationalistic and less committed to European unity. In our timeline, Germany's commitment to the European Union and to peaceful cooperation with its neighbors comes partly from a deep determination to never repeat the mistakes of the Nazi era. In the alternate timeline, with a more ambiguous narrative about World War II, this commitment might be weaker. The European Union might not exist at all, or might be much weaker. The EU was built partly on the idea that economic and political integration would prevent another war in Europe. But it was also built on a clear understanding of what went wrong in the 1930s and 1940s. If that understanding is muddier, the motivation for integration is weaker. NATO would still exist and would be stronger. The military threat from the Soviet Union during the Cold War would have been greater, so Western Europe would be more committed to collective defense. NATO would be more focused on military preparedness and less on political dialogue. Russia in 2025 would probably be similar to our timeline. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the difficult transition to a market economy would happen the same way. Vladimir Putin or someone like him would probably still be in power, pursuing similar nationalist and authoritarian policies. The United States would be roughly similar. The experience of the Cold War would have been different, more focused on the military confrontation in Europe rather than proxy wars in the developing world. This might make American foreign policy more focused on Europe and less interventionist in other regions. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan might not have happened, or might have happened differently. The Middle East would be somewhat different. If European powers were more focused on the Cold War confrontation in Europe, they might have been less involved in the Middle East. The politics of oil would still draw outside powers into the region, but the specific conflicts and alliances might be different. Israel would exist and would probably face similar challenges. The fundamental conflict between Israelis and Palestinians would still exist regardless of the details of how World War II ended. The broader Arab-Israeli conflict would follow similar patterns. China would be the biggest wild card. In our timeline, the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War in 1949 and then went through various phases: alliance with the Soviet Union, then split from the Soviet Union, then opening to the West under Deng Xiaoping, then the massive economic growth of recent decades. In the alternate timeline, if the Cold War in Europe was more intense and more militarized, the superpowers might have less attention and resources to spare for Asia. This could give China more room to develop independently, or it could mean that the United States would be even more opposed to communist expansion in Asia, leading to more intense conflicts. The technological development of our world would probably be similar. The space race would still happen, driven by superpower competition. The internet would still be invented, probably by the American military, just like in our timeline. Computers and smartphones and all the technology we have today would probably still develop on a similar timeline because the underlying scientific principles are the same. Climate change would still be happening. The burning of fossil fuels that drives climate change would occur regardless of the political details of the mid-20th century. We would still be facing the same environmental challenges today. So in many ways, the world of 2025 in this alternate timeline might not look that different from our real world. But the differences that do exist would be significant. A less unified Europe, a more militarized culture in Germany and possibly other European countries, a more contested memory of World War II, and perhaps a greater awareness of the moral ambiguity of history, the idea that even people who do the right thing might have done wrong things before, and that history is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. And that brings us to the ultimate lesson of this what-if scenario. History is complicated. The assassination of Hitler sounds like it would obviously make the world better. But when you think through all the consequences, the answer is not so clear. Some things would be better. Some things would be worse. And many things would just be different, neither better nor worse. Just alternate versions of the same human struggles. The men who tried to kill Hitler were not saints. They were not heroes. But they were not pure villains either. They were complicated human beings who made choices in impossible situations. They waited too long to act. They acted for imperfect reasons. But they did act, and they paid with their lives. In our timeline, they failed. History remembers them as tragic figures who tried and failed to stop a monster. In the alternate timeline where they succeeded, history would remember them as controversial figures who did something brave but for complicated reasons, and whose success led to unexpected consequences. Maybe the real lesson is that there are no simple answers in history. Every action has consequences, both intended and unintended. Every choice creates new problems even as it solves old ones. The world is too complex for simple heroes and villains, too interconnected for any single event to change everything, and too driven by deeper forces for any individual or group to fully control. Operation Valkyrie was the closest anyone came to killing Hitler. A briefcase bomb, a heavy oak table, a table leg, 6 inches. That was all that stood between our timeline and something completely different. 6 inches determined the fate of millions of people and the shape of the world for generations. It makes you think about all the other small moments in history that could have gone differently. What if the weather had been different on D-Day? What if Archduke Franz Ferdinand's driver had not taken a wrong turn in 1914? What if any of 1,000 other small details had been slightly different? History is full of these moments. We live in the one timeline that actually happened, but we can imagine the countless other timelines that could have been. And in imagining them, we understand our own timeline better. We see how fragile and contingent everything is. We see how small choices can have huge consequences. We see how complicated the world really is. The story of Operation Valkyrie is a reminder that history is made by human beings making difficult choices in difficult circumstances. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes their success creates new problems. Sometimes their failure prevents worse outcomes. We can never know for sure what would have happened if things had gone differently. But we can think about it. We can explore the possibilities. We can learn from the what-ifs. And maybe, just maybe, we can make better choices in our own time because we understand how complex and unpredictable the consequences of our choices can be. That briefcase was moved 6 inches. Hitler survived. The war continued for 10 more months. Millions more people died. The world became what it is today, all because of 6 inches and a table leg. Subscribe for more alternate history scenarios that make you see the world differently.